My name is Caitlin Reed, and I want to tell you about the Thursday evening phone call that arrived 11 days before my wedding and what I did with the life that opened up in the space it left behind. I am 34 years old, and I run a marketing agency in Nashville, Tennessee, and I am in a relationship that makes sense in a way my previous one never quite did. And I want to tell you the full story because the full story is not the one you might expect, and it is more useful than the one that sounds better. Ryan and I had been together for 4 years when he called that Thursday. 4 years that had produced the specific texture of a shared life, the apartment we had picked furniture for together, and the couple friends who were already us rather than his people and my people, and the future we had been building in the way that people in their late 20s build futures, with the slightly anxious optimism of someone who has found the right direction and is moving in it and hopes the direction holds. I had known something was shifting for about 3 weeks. Not dramatically, not in a way I could point to clearly. He had been different in the specific small ways that you notice when you have been paying close attention to someone for 4 years. The conversations that ended slightly before their natural conclusion. The evenings where he was present in the room, but not quite present in the way he had always been present. I told myself I was reading into things. I told myself the wedding stress was affecting both of us. I told myself the things you tell yourself when the alternative is a conversation you are not ready to have. He called at 7:43 on a Thursday evening. I was in the kitchen. I answered and he said my name, Caitlin, in the specific way that told me before the next sentence arrived that the next sentence was going to be significant. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I did not know I was going to do that. My legs simply made the decision before my brain had finished processing what was coming. He said he had been seeing someone. He said it had become serious. He said she came from a family with resources and connections that had opened doors he had not known existed, and that he could not walk away from what that represented. He said he was sorry. He hoped I would understand someday. He called off our wedding 11 days before it was scheduled to happen. 214 invitations were already in the mail. I sat on the kitchen floor for 40 minutes after the call ended, and then I stood up and I made a decision about who I was going to be in response to this. And that decision is the whole story. I want to tell you about the 40 minutes on the floor because I think they matter, and because the version of this story that skips directly to the triumph is less honest and less useful than the version that includes what the floor felt like. The floor was cold. That is the most specific thing I remember. The kitchen tile was cold, and I sat on it with my back against the lower cabinet and my phone in my lap, and I felt the cold. And I felt the specific quality of understanding something all at once that you had been only partially understanding before. The shift in him over the previous 3 weeks resolved itself into a complete picture in those 40 minutes. And the complete picture was that Ryan had been making a calculation about his life, and I had been the losing side of that calculation. And he had let me plan a wedding and mail 214 invitations while he was making it. That was the thing that sat most heavily in those 40 minutes. Not that he had chosen someone else. People choose someone else. That is painful and real, and it happened, and it was going to take time to process. What sat most heavily was the calculation, the specific, deliberate assessment of options in which I was one option, and a wealthier woman was another option. And the calculation had produced a conclusion, and he had let me live inside a different conclusion while he was arriving at his. I did not cry on the kitchen floor. I want to say that not to perform toughness, but because it is true, and I think it is interesting. I did not cry. I was too busy understanding. The understanding was too complete and too fast for tears in that moment. The tears came later in smaller amounts over many weeks, rather than all at once in the kitchen, and I think that was the right distribution for what I was processing. When I stood up, I had two things clear in my mind. The first was practical. There was a venue and a caterer and a florist and a photographer and 214 people who had invitations in the mail, and all of those things needed to be addressed. I called my best friend Maya that night, and she came over and we made a list and we started making calls the next morning. And we handled it with the specific organized efficiency of two women who know how to manage complex problems and who understood that the managing was not the grief, but that doing it well was a way of taking care of myself in a moment when taking care of myself was the only available priority. The second thing clear in my mind was less practical and more fundamental. I was not going to spend the energy I had on making Ryan regret what he had done. I am going to explain why that was not a noble decision. It was not about nobility, it was about math. The math was simple. I had a finite amount of energy and a clear choice about where to direct it. And I had the specific professional clarity of a woman who had been running marketing campaigns for 7 years and who understood that attention directed at one thing is attention not directed at another, and that the question is always what produces the better return on the investment. Directing my energy at Ryan produced what return exactly? He knew what he had done, a public confrontation or a social media exposure or a campaign of the kind that satisfying revenge scenarios are built from would have produced temporary satisfaction and permanent cost, because the cost of that kind of campaign is carried by the person conducting it in the form of the months or years it occupies and the version of herself she has to be to sustain it. I did not want to be that version of myself. I had a different version in mind. The marketing agency had been the plan before Ryan. I had spent 2 years building it as a side project alongside my corporate job, and by the time Ryan and I had been together for 2 years, I had 5 clients and a business model that worked, and the specific potential of a thing that had not yet been given full attention. When the relationship became more serious, I had pulled back on the agency time because Ryan had needed things from me that required my presence and attention, and because I had believed that the relationship was the investment worth making and that the agency could wait. The agency had been waiting for 2.5 years. In the month after the wedding, that did not happen. I told my corporate employer I was leaving. I gave 6 weeks' notice because 6 weeks was what the situation required, and I have never done things less carefully than they require to be done. I spent those 6 weeks preparing to go full time on the agency in the way that you prepare for something when you have been thinking about it for 2.5 years and have a clear plan and a base of clients and the specific focused energy of a woman who has just had a significant amount of her life freed up for redirection. My former corporate colleagues thought I was having a breakdown. My friend Maya knew I was not. She had heard the math conversation on the kitchen floor night, and she understood that what looked from the outside like a woman reacting to a bad breakup was actually a woman executing a plan she had been waiting to execute, and that the timing was not, despite the breakup, but genuinely independent of it. The space had opened. I was filling it with the thing I had been meaning to fill it with. The agency launched fully in April, 6 weeks after the Thursday call. The first year of running the agency full time was the hardest professional year of my life. And I want to be honest about that because the story of someone who redirected their energy after a betrayal and succeeded is only useful if it includes what the succeeding actually required rather than presenting it as a natural consequence of having the right attitude. I worked 60 hours a week for the first 8 months. I lost one client in month 3 when a scope disagreement produced an ending I handled professionally, but that still cost me revenue I had been counting on. I hired my first employee in month 5, and the hiring was wrong. Not her fault, and not mine exactly. A mismatch of expectations that I should have identified earlier in the process, and that required an uncomfortable conversation and a separation that cost both of us something. I made better hiring decisions after that because I had made that one and understood what to look for. The agency grew, not dramatically in the first year, in the real way that real things grow, through consistent work and the accumulation of a reputation that comes from delivering results rather than promising them. By the end of the first year, I had 12 clients and 2 employees and revenue that exceeded what I had been making in my corporate role. By the end of the second year, I had 19 clients and 4 employees and a second Nashville office space because the first had become too small. I thought about Ryan occasionally in the first year, not constantly. Occasionally, in the specific way that significant relationships occupy space in your thinking even after they have ended, surfacing at unexpected moments and requiring a moment of acknowledgement before they recede again. I acknowledged them and let them recede. I did not look him up on social media. I did not ask mutual friends how he was doing. I did not track the progress of the relationship he had chosen. Those things were not mine to track, and tracking them would have cost me something I could not afford to spend. About 14 months after the Thursday call, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Ryan's relationship with the wealthier woman had ended. I heard this, and I felt nothing in the specific, satisfying way that I'd hoped I would feel nothing, which was not numbness, but genuine indifference. The real kind that arrives not from suppressing feelings, but from having directed your attention somewhere else for long enough that the somewhere else has become the whole picture. I did not feel vindicated. I did not feel sad for him. I felt genuinely nothing, and I noted the genuinely nothing, and I went back to work. Daniel had been my colleague at the corporate job for 3 years before I left. We had worked together on 3 campaigns, and I had a clear professional respect for him and a clear personal liking for him in the uncomplicated way that you like colleagues who are good at their jobs and decent to the people around them and who do not require any management beyond the professional. We had never been anything other than colleagues. The thought had not occurred to me during the Ryan years because I was in the Ryan years, and I was not thinking in that direction. He reached out 8 months after I launched the agency. Not romantically, professionally. He had left the corporate job himself and was freelancing and wanted to know if there was a project collaboration opportunity. I said yes. We worked together on a client project for 6 weeks. The project went well, and the working together went well in the specific way that working with someone goes well, when both people are competent and clear and enjoyable to spend professional time with. He asked me to dinner after the project closed. He said, I want to be clear that I'm asking you to dinner as a person who would like to have dinner with you and not as a professional contact following up on a project. He said it with the slight seriousness of a man who wanted to make sure the communication was accurate, and not misread. I said, I understood the distinction. I said, yes. So we had dinner, then another dinner. Then the kind of relationship that builds slowly and with the specific quality of two people who are both fully themselves and are building something on that basis rather than on the basis of who they are performing themselves to be for each other. It was the easiest significant relationship I had ever been in because it had not required me to be anyone other than the version of myself I had spent the previous 2 years building back to fully. I told him about Ryan on our fourth or fifth date. He listened without performing an appropriate reaction. He said, that sounds like it was a hard year. I said, it was. He said, you seem like someone who handled it well. I said, I had good math. He did not know what I meant, and I explained the math conversation from the kitchen floor, and he understood immediately because he is the kind of person who understands immediately. And that matters enormously when you have spent the previous 4 years with someone who had a different relationship with that kind of honesty. I think about what I want to say at the end of this story, and what I keep coming back to is not the satisfaction of the agency or the relationship or the clarity about who I am that the previous 3 years have produced, though all of those things are real and true and worth having. What I keep coming back to is something smaller and more foundational than any of them. Self respect is not what you have when nothing bad has happened to you. It is what you have when something bad has happened and you have chosen not to let the response to it cost you more than the thing itself already cost. Ryan cost me a wedding that did not happen, and 4 years of a relationship that had a different foundation than I understood, and 11 days of invitations that needed to be recalled. I decided on a kitchen floor that those were the costs and that the response was not going to add to them. The response was the agency. The response was the work. The response was the full version of myself built without the weight of someone else's calculation about what I was worth. And the response was a Thursday evening dinner with a man who said, I want to be clear that I am asking you to dinner as a person who would like to have dinner with you, which is the most honest sentence anyone has ever used to start something with me, and which produced, in the most quiet and ordinary way, exactly what I had always actually been looking for. That is my story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.